I'm David Krause, co-founder of the C.S. Lewis Festival in Petoskey, Michigan. This September marks our 19th year as the world's only month-long festival. And I am happy to announce that we have renowned author Philip Yancy as our keynote speaker. Philip has written over 25 books, many of them bestsellers, and you know many of the titles. Where is God When It Hurts? The Jesus I Never Knew. What's So Amazing About Grace? This will be Philip's third appearance in Petoskey, and we couldn't be happier. I sat down with Philip for a brief interview as a prelude to this year's festival. Please enjoy the interview. So welcome.
Thank you.
It's great finally being able to sit down with you. I've wanted on the long list of interviews that I've been able to conduct through my career, I would have to say you're the one that I've waited the most for, simply because of all the books that I've been able to read of yours. So, Philip, tell me what's going on in your life. What are you working on right now?
I am in the very last stages of writing a memoir. Well, I can still remember things. And it's taken me about 3 years. I've never had a writing project quite like this. I started, the first draft, I just wrote down everything I could remember. And that was 240,000 words. My publisher said, that's 3 times too large, so you need to cut 2/3 of it. And I've got it down to about 100,000 words. And it's a new type of writing for me. Most of my writings have been idea-driven. This one is story-driven, and it happens to be my story. So it was a different experience for me.
Have you thought about doing this for a while, or what prompted you to decide to do this?
I've thought about it for a long time. One of my heroes as a writer is Frederick Buechner. I think you know him as well. And he says, you really only have one story. That's your story. That's why you were put on earth. And writers, even writers of faith, tend to be finding ways to express their ideas through the story, through the emergence, through the pilgrimage of settling to where they are now. And that was true of me. I grew up in a very unhealthy family and toxic church background, and that's colored everything I've written. So now I'm describing kind of the prequel to books that I've already written. This is what was going on behind the scenes that led me into those questions that I've explored in my other books.
Who's the audience? Who's it intended for?
People who have read my books may want to know some of the background, but that wasn't our primary audience. Our primary audience was to explain a subculture to America at large. People in New York, for example, they know that 30 to 40% of Americans have, in recent times, called themselves born again or evangelical, but they've never met one because they live in New York, you know. And they have these presumptions that come mostly from watching CNN and the news about what an evangelical is, which is very different than my own experience. And what I wanted to do was explain the subculture so that at the end of the day, they could say, okay, there's some good things and there's some bad things, but despite the bad things, the kernel of faith that lies at the core, it's like the pearl of great price that Jesus described. I grew up in a very unhealthy background, and as a writer, I've tried to peel away the things that came with that Southern racist fundamentalist subculture, and I did find a kernel that was worth devoting my life toward. And I would like to do that in a way that a New York person could read it and say, well, I don't think I want to be one of those, but now I can understand why someone does.
You know, it's interesting. Your career has been defined by doubt. And how you've written about that. I'm looking at your book titles: Disappointment with God, Vanishing Grace, Where is God When It Hurts, The Jesus I Never Knew. When did you realize that these questions you were asking yourself, these doubts that you had as well, would be shared by so many other people, so many other readers?
Yeah. I had no idea. Early in my career, I was fortunate enough to latch on to a person who helped form my faith. That's Dr. Paul Brand. We spent about 10 years working together, and 3 different books came out of that. And that was great for me because I could write about his faith with great confidence, while I couldn't write about my faith with confidence yet. And then I turned a corner, and that's about the time we moved to Colorado, actually, David, because we were living in Chicago. Chicago's a great place for journalism. You walk outside the door and somebody's getting mugged or something big is happening, but a bad place for introspective, introverted type writing, because car alarms are going off. It's a busy city, you know, and so we moved. We found a new place. And I started exploring my own journey. What should I keep and what should I throw away from that mixed heritage that I grew up with? And I learned early on, I don't write books about something I know the answer to. I would be bored within 2 weeks for that. I write books about something I don't know the answer to. And that gives me a chance to go to people who can be helpful, to study the Bible, and to just have a pilgrimage of going down this path, trying to figure out some of these questions. So many of my books have a question as a title, and I feel tremendously privileged, actually, to be able to make a living writing books that I would be exploring, about questions that I would be exploring already. These are questions I have. I'm privileged to be able to spend usually a year on a book trying to figure it out. I wrote a book about prayer. Does it make any difference? I was the world's worst prayer. And I thought, well, that's a good reason to write a book, so I can find out who does it well and what can I learn from them.
I often wonder if you've come up with the title of the book and like an essay, you then fill out the book. But you said that it's almost a dialogue for you in your writing. And I really, it resonated with me, particularly as it relates to how hard it is. I'm not an author, I'm a film producer, but how hard it is for an author to actually be able to get the words out. Do they tumble out like C.S. Lewis commented, almost from God?
C.S. Lewis is very rare.
Yeah.
When I know a lot of writers, and when I ask them, they always say, I love having written. For me, the writing process divides into 3 stages. Getting ready to write, and that's the research and outlining. I do very detailed outlines before I start writing. Getting ready to write, and then composing. Having that blank screen or blank piece of paper and having to put the words down. That's the hard part for me. I love the preparatory stuff. And then the last part is editing. And I usually spend twice as much time editing the material as composing it. That middle time, that middle stage, is where all the pain is. And I wouldn't say they tumble out, but I force myself to just keep going because the more I write, the more I'm aware of what I'm doing wrong as I do it. And writing is kind of blanking out those negative messages. What a cliche, you've already said this, nobody cares about this. You know, these are dancing around in my head all day long. And I'm just trying to come up with one more sentence and then one more sentence. So it's a psychological battle, really.
You know, you're a journalist. You identify as a journalist, but I don't think you write as a journalist. I find it there's much more warmth. It's frequently when I'm writing, and I suspect that many that are viewing this interview would agree that it's a dialogue that you're having with the reader.
Yeah.
That's hard to do.
Yes. I'm not really thinking of the reader. I'm thinking of, how do I get through this? I likened it one time. How do I get through this forest? I'm out there hacking my way with a machete, you know, trying to find a way. And then suddenly I break through and there's the Pacific Ocean. I made it. And then I look behind me, and to my great surprise, there are a bunch of people saying, thank you for clearing the trail. You know, we followed you. But when I'm doing the writing itself, it's trying to find a way through the thicket, through the dense foliage. But I would have to say, the reason I identify with as a journalist, I started in magazines, and unlike C.S. Lewis, for example, I'm not a specialist. He was a specialist in medieval literature and had that incredible ability to speak to children in the Narnia series, to science fiction fans, to ordinary Brits at home in the middle of a war, not knowing what to believe about the future and what was going on. And that's what a journalist does. A journalist starts not as a specialist, but with curiosity, and can go to the experts. So when I was a magazine journalist, you know, I could write about how to ride a bicycle, or how to assemble a nuclear bomb, or, you know, whatever they give you to write about. And I could go to the experts, and my job was to make it somehow intelligible to the ordinary reader. And that's what I do. I'm not a pastor, I'm not a theologian, I'm not an academic. I've studied those things, but that's not my specialty. My specialty is to communicate the stuff up here to people like me down here.
Yeah, the way you do it effectively. You talk about C.S. Lewis. When did your interest in C.S. Lewis begin?
It was in college. And the college I went to was so conservative. It was a Bible college first. I went to several, but the Bible college was so conservative that they didn't allow C.S. Lewis books, because he smoked a pipe and he drank bourbon and wine and everything.
Right.
Well, I was one of the rebels in that college, and so that, of course, made me want to read him. You know, what's this guy got going that they're trying to stamp out? And I think my very first acquaintance was the Space Trilogy, which made the supernatural believable. Yeah. So like a murder mystery, it just sends chills up your spine. You realize, what if this is really true? And then questions I had, like the problem of pain, grief observed, those kinds of things. Whenever I would start thinking about an issue, and then later writing about an issue, I'd always go first to C.S. Lewis to see what he had to say about it.
A number of years ago, at the beginning of our C.S. Lewis Festival, we have a Saturday seminar, and Dr. Jerry Root was the speaker that morning, and he had no more begun. In fact, I think he had just gotten good morning out when this hand went up, and it was a person who clearly had been drugged there by her husband or boyfriend, and she got Jerry's attention. He asked yes, and she goes, "Who is C.S. Lewis, and why should I know about him?" My question to you is, who is C.S. Lewis, and why should I know about him?
C.S. Lewis is the greatest apologist of modern times. And an apologist is someone who can explain the faith in a winsome and convincing way. And it's kind of sad in a way that he's been dead for what, 57 years, something like that. And it's sad that no one has come along and taken that mantle in the same way. But he was raised as he was an atheist when he was a young man, had terrible experiences in World War I in the trenches, and then gradually was convinced through his friendship with people like J.R.R. Tolkien and Charles Williams, became convinced that although the Christian story sounded a lot like myths that you see in various literature, Norse mythology, German mythology, there was a difference. This myth was true. It was a true story that God wanted to communicate with us, and the best way God could communicate with human beings was to become a human being. And then, shock of all shocks, that Son of God was killed and voluntarily gave his life. It was an incredible story that captured him, and ultimately he became convinced that it was true. So he's primarily known as an apologist, kind of a lay theologian, I guess you would say. But he was incredibly creative. So in the war, children would leave London to go to safer places while the bombing was taking place. He had some of those children in his own home and started telling them stories, and eventually that grew into the Narnia tales, which have sold millions and millions. A friend of mine in publishing went in New York streets and went to different bookshops, and that day he bought, I think, 56 different books, completely different books by C.S. Lewis, still in print, some 50 years after his death. I mean, what author can you say that about? And at the same time, he kept up his scholarly pursuits and wrote for the Oxford Dictionary of English Literature. He wrote one of the volumes. Was a Don in Cambridge and Oxford as well. Just a remarkable man who was dropped into our century. And in the midst of the war, he was asked by the BBC, can you do a series of radio talks? Well, he had no experience. He wasn't really interested, but they talked him into it. The country needed him. And he just sat down and talked on the radio, and that became Mere Christianity, 3 different volumes included in one. A great gift to the kingdom of God and to the world at large.
I have been struck by the number of people that have reached out to me of my film on C.S. Lewis that aired for many years on PBS that were either in between, torn between believing, not believing, and how Lewis was able to answer their questions, I should say. You have written, and I like the term borderline.
Right.
Borderline. Explain that a little bit. What you mean by that?
Right. Well, think of geography. Well, we're in northern Michigan, and we're close to the border between our northern neighbor Canada, and or think of the Koreas. There's South Korea, and then North Korea, and then South Korea, and in between there's this strip that's neither North Korea or South Korea. It's full of landmines. You dare not go. And I hear it's quite a wildlife preserve because no humans are there, so the wildlife prosper. And that's where a lot of people are in their faith. Some of them, because like me, they were raised with a faith that just doesn't work for them after a while. I realized there were some things that I was taught in my church that were just flat wrong, like the racist doctrines. And then other people who just had no exposure to faith. And that group in the middle, they're not hostile. They may be curious, or especially if some disaster happens or an illness happens or their close friend dies, they want answers. They want to ask questions. And they don't know where to go. They probably wouldn't voluntarily show up at a church. It seems too foreign. Everybody knows the language and they know what to do, and they don't because they're not a citizen of that country yet. And so those are the people in the middle, and C.S. Lewis was brilliant at speaking to those people because he had been in the borderlands himself and understood. And I guess I'd have to say, for different reasons, I came from a very churched background, but not a healthy one. I came with similar questions to what Lewis came up with from his agnostic stance and wanted to find answers to those questions, and we ended up in a very close place.
For those viewers who are in between, Philip has written a wonderful book called A Skeptic's Guide to Faith, highly recommended. And in fact, I have purchased many books of The Skeptic's Guide and handing them out. And what's interesting is I have read it and I have learned more as a Christian than I did before I read it. So, well, thank you. We look forward to Philip Yancy, who will be coming as keynote speaker to the 19th annual C.S. Lewis Festival in Petoskey, Michigan this September. Please go to our website, cslewisfestival.org, for all the details, dates, times, places, particularly when and where Philip will be speaking. Thank you, Philip.
It's been a pleasure, David.